It has been said that if you wish to see far ahead in time, you must first look far back to find lessons from the past. The archiving of documents from the past and the present is an important source for architecture and design. It captures the passing of time. It is a testament to the evolution of the discipline. The following masterclasses record the individual processes of professionals and their ways of working.
Hola, buenos dias, good morning. My name is Ulrich Obrist. I'm the Artistic Director of the Serpentine Galleries. Thank you so much to Elena and to Norman Foster and all the teams at the Foster Foundation for the invitation to participate in this workshop. And I'm going to talk today about archives, but also about interarchives, about what is happening between archives, about the space between archives, which is a project we did actually with the University of Lüneburg, exploring how we can connect archives with each other. The beginning really of the reflection on the archive, I wanted to sort of start with Edouard Glissant. Edouard Glissant, who was my friend, my mentor, from whom I learned a lot about archive. And of course, Glissant was a poet, he was a philosopher, a public intellectual, a curator, whose work was not only the literary and theoretical work and his poetry, but of course also the production of reality through the institutions he founded. He actually started the Institut Martiniquais d'études, which was a school as an agent for change in 1967, a school which was so important for Martinique, and later imagined actually an art institution, a museum, a collection, and an archive, which remains, even if unrealized, a source of many, many ideas. Glissant imagined the museum and actually the archive as an archipelago. In that sense, it would not house a synthesis, but a network of interrelationships. And I think that is a very important first point, that this idea of an archive not being a synthesis, but a network of interrelationships. The second thing was that he actually wanted to create a museum and an institution, an archive, which would not only point at urgencies, but also find agency to respond to these urgencies. And that, of course, means that it would not only be about representation, but it could actually also be about production of reality. And that's, of course, very much what happens with the Foster Foundation. She's an extraordinary archive, but also through the workshops, through the school, through all it does, is very involved in producing the future and scenarios for the 21st century. The third point Edouard Glissant makes about the archive is, and the museum as a matter of fact, is that he imagined it to be a quivering place which transcends established systems of thoughts and which is looking for the utopian point where all the world's cultures and all the world's imaginations can meet and hear one another. So the idea of it being a quivering place, the idea of it transcending established systems of thought, I think very important for a 21st century archive. And as part of this point also, the search, in a way, for the utopian point where all the world's cultures and all the world's imaginations can meet and hear one another. I would say the fourth point Glissant taught me is the idea to not treat an archive as a rarefied commodity, not a gated, rarefied commodity with walls, but actually to see it as a daily practice, really, of archiving, to see it as and that's interestingly enough also the point Alexis Pauling-Gams made. Alexis Pauling-Gams in the incredible book Archive, which I think is very relevant in relation also to Glissant and to Sylvia Winter. And Alexis Pauling-Gams in Archive talks about the necessity to actually not treat the archive as a rarefied commodity, but actually in a way to engage in this daily practice of documenting. And of course, this idea also that it's not a gated institution means also that we try to avoid that there are walls. No, the idea that archives should be for everyone. I mean, Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web in 1989. It had its 30th anniversary the year before last. It's now 32 years old. And of course, Tim Berners-Lee always said about the World Wide Web, this should be for everyone. And this idea, I think, of access. And of course, that means to also go with the archive, to not only invite everyone to an archive, but to go with the archive to maybe also unexpected places I think is very important, because ultimately only a very limited number of people otherwise have access to it. And that actually brings us to the next point, which is the point of the interarchive. The interarchive is an idea we have because I've always worked with my archive as an active archive. So the opposite actually of it being somehow a closed entity. And I wanted it to be a workshop, a laboratory. So in the 1990s, I worked with the University of Lüneburg in Germany. And we had a project where we invited artists such as Christian Boltanski or Hans-Peter Feldmann to actually work with my archive and work with the students with all the books. So all my books were in Lüneburg, and we created lots of different systems of categorization, order and disorder. In a way, it was a very, very productive time, but then the archive actually had to move because the university ended the project after 10 years. The archive then went to Berlin, and it's now in Arles at the Luma Foundation. And of course, looking at these archive, I think in a way, I wanted to talk about my archive actually as many archives within the archive. I think in a way, an archive always, I would say, hides another archive. It's almost like a Russian matryoshka, right? So that you have the archive within the archive. In the next part of this short presentation, I wanted to talk a little bit about my multiple archives. I think an archive always hides another archive. So it's not one archive, it's a multitude of archives, and they're all interconnected. And then somehow also talk about how this actually connects to other archives. I think one thing also Edouard Glissant taught me about this idea of the archive and the museum as an archipelago is that the archive would never illustrate previously established findings, but functions as an active laboratory. Or as Glissant said, it's not a recapitulation of something which existed in an obvious way. It's the quest for something we don't know yet. And I think this quest, which of course connects deeply to the Glissantian idea of finding the point where all the world's cultures and the world's imaginations can meet and hear one another. At the center of my archive is definitely the interview project. It's the so far almost 4,000 hours of conversations with artists, with architects, with scientists, which I have been recording since the beginning of the 90s. And this archive is basically, I would say about half of it is audio and half of it is video. And I'm really very grateful to Jonas Mekas, because Jonas Mekas actually told me that he really feels I should film these interviews, because he felt that in a way it would be so easy to just have a small camera on the table and film them. And I think without Jonas, I would never have had this idea of recording and certainly not filming these many conversations. So I would like to dedicate this really to Jonas and the late Jonas Mekas, the extraordinary filmmaker. And I would say that definitely has a lot to do with him, that this archive today exists. Now, within these interviews, there are, of course, lots of recurrent conversations where I would talk to artists again and again. There is always the curiosity, of course, for what a new generation of artists is doing. So it's a permanent research. I continue even to do that actually during the lockdown, where, of course, traveling is completely impossible, but there I continue to actually record these conversations by Zoom and make Zoom studio visits. Now, obviously, a Zoom studio visit would never replace, a real physical studio visit, but it can be some form of temporary ersatz. It can be a prelude to a later studio visit, which hopefully can happen once the lockdown is lifted. But also, I would say it allows me actually to visit studios in the countryside, in places I would never have visited, because obviously I realized looking at the archive that most of the conversations have been recorded in the cities where I spend a lot of time, in Paris, where I lived for more than 10 years, London, where I lived for more than 10 years, and of course, several other cities where I would very regularly visit, like New York and Beijing, and also Accra. There was a whole long visit in Accra where we recorded conversations, Vienna, Berlin, Seoul. So in a way, it's all cities, right? And so it's interesting, several visits also to Cape Town and Johannesburg. There's a whole archive of studio visits. There's also a whole series, I would say, of many, many conversations in Milano, but it's all cities. And I would say the biggest change now during the lockdown is that I visited a lot of artists who live in the countryside by by Zoom, sometimes in extremely inaccessible and very remote areas. So these are the conversations, of course, with artists. Then there are, of course, the portraits, I would say, of groups. For example, the idea of making a whole series of conversations like the marathons, where one would bring, several artists together and use a conversation which sort of forms a more collective conversation. The format of the marathon started in Stuttgart in 2005, so that's another part of the archive. And then an important part is to not only look into emerging practices, but also what Eric Hobsbawm called the protest against forgetting, because very early on in my research, I visited Rosemarie Trockel, and Rosemarie Trockel in Cologne basically said that she thinks that I should visit pioneering artists who live all over the world, but whose work is not enough remembered. And she said particularly so many women artists haven't had enough attention. She mentioned that Louise Bourgeois in the 80s, studio visit I was 17 then, it was in 1985. And Louise Bourgeois just started to have more visibility. But Rosemarie said there are so many other extraordinary women artists, who need more visibility. So she said, she gave me a task, right? She said, basically, you should go from city to city and you should just ask, who are pioneering women artists whom you should visit. And that's how I met, soon after, Maria Lasnik, in Vienna, Aurigia Pape in Brazil, and so on. It became a whole series of, I would say, hundreds of recordings, right, in that archive, and very often, like in the case, for example, of Monia Sharudi Farman, and then led to books. So that's, of course, the other aspect is very often the recordings, the conversations then lead to books. Maybe interesting also that in this archive of conversations, there are certain recurrent questions which I always ask. The certainly most central question is the question about the unrealized project. That's again a task which was given to me by an artist, by Alighiero Boetti, the late Italian artist. He said I should ask artists about their dreams, about their utopias, about projects which they haven't been able to realize. And of course, that again was, had a lot to do with Glissant and the definition I was thinking about the unrealized projects, and it's again a task given to me by an artist, the late Alighiero Boetti. When I visited him in Rome, I was 18 in 1986. He told me that we should really focus on unrealized projects by artists, because he said so many artists actually have projects and dreams they would like to realize, but within the existing art world, it doesn't fit into any categories. He said, so we should kind of invert this aspect, right? And we should archive unrealized projects. And I think the unrealized project aspect is maybe an example of how it really is about production of reality, how the archive is a lab, is an organism, is growing, but is also about actually making things happen in the case of my archive. Because the archive sort of presentation of these unrealized projects is, of course, there in order to create awareness for them and make these projects happen, make this artist dream become a reality. And of course, it brings us also to Utopia, which is again a connection to Edouard Glissant, because Edouard Glissant was actually really very skeptical of these static systems of Utopia, like Plato's Republic or Thomas More's Utopia, because he felt them, too static. So he wanted there to be an alternative form of Utopia consisting of a continuous dialogue, which is very much what my archive is about, right? It's the archive as a continuous dialogue. Ernst Bloch defined Utopia as something that's missing, and Glissant then, in his fabulous novel Sartorius from 1999, describes the utopian Batutu people deriving the identity not from a genealogy, but solely from being in constant exchange with others. So Glissant referred to Utopia as a trembling Utopia because it transcends established systems of thought. To quote him here from one of my interviews in the archive, it must be said from the start that trembling is not uncertainty and it's not fear. Trembling thought, and in my opinion, every utopia passes through this kind of thought, is first of all the instinctive feeling that we must reject all categories of fixed thought and all categories of imperial thought. The all world trembles. The all world trembles physically. The all world trembles geologically, mentally, spiritually, because the all world is looking for the point, not the station, but the point where all these cultures can meet. So Utopia, Glissant says, is a reality where one can meet with the other without losing oneself. That, I think, is somehow the attempt of archiving all these conversations. I mentioned before books. Of course, books are an important part of my archive. There are probably about 30,000 books, artist books, catalogs, and so on. But of course, also the idea of the archive being a kind of a book machine, no? So that basically the conversations, the recordings, actually often are transcribed and then produce publications. And then, of course, I mean, the exhibition is my medium. I'm a museum director and a curator, and since I would say 1991, now for 30 years, when I started with the kitchen show. I mean, exhibitions are my medium. I started to curate in 1991 with the kitchen show World Soup, and the exhibitions, of course, have a limited lifespan. They last. Some exhibitions last a day, others last a month, others last 6 months, others last a year. But they always do have a limited lifespan. So it's, of course, important how we document them. It can be through photographies. It can, again, be through oral history, through interviews. It can be through films, filming exhibitions. There are many different ways of documenting exhibitions, and I think each of the exhibition has, in that sense, its own archive. I think archives have also to do, in that regard, thinking about the limited lifespan of exhibitions or of events, even more so, events have a shorter duration than exhibitions. I would say archive has always to do with this idea of la longue durée. It's interesting to go back, in a way, to the French Annales School of Historical Writing and to Fernand Braudel, who gives priority to the long duration as opposed to what Simeon calls the evental history. And a very interesting book, important book by Roman Kajanik, How to Be a Good Ancestor. It raises the question, actually, how to be a good ancestor. Shows us that we very much live in an age of short-termism with social media. And he says, in relation to actually the environmental questions, also the extinction crisis, it is so important that we, again, can sort of have a longer durational perspective and realize that our lifetime is very, very short in relation to the duration, one can say, of the planet, right? And the idea also how important it actually is to consider future generations when we make decisions today is very much part with this relearning of having a long-term perspective, which I think archives can give us. And Kajanik shows us 6 ways of actually liberating our society from this destructive short-termism and going more into a longue durée. It can go through cathedral thinking, projects on which we work for a very long time, and I think archives are that. It's not an exhibition, it's not a lecture or an event, it's something we work on more or less for our entire life, and it takes into account this idea, actually, what might happen with it in the long term. And that, of course, relates to the second point, to deep time humility, and also, thirdly, the legacy mindset. The fourth point is intergenerational justice, that we think about generations who are not born yet and what it means for them. Holistic forecasting, and last but not least, also the transcendental goal. So this idea of actually seeing an archive also in that chain of life is, I think, a very important aspect. And an example for that is certainly Do It. I wanted to sort of mention one exhibition which probably has most, I would say, volume, but also most participants. And in a way, it's not so much about space than about time. It's the archive which has most time in my archive, and that's the project Do It. It's a project we started in 1993 in Paris, and which has so far taken place in 169 cities and smaller towns all over the world. Do It is an exhibition constituted by instructions, by recipes, by how-to manuals, and these can be interpreted and reinterpreted in many different ways all over the world. And each time the exhibition takes place somewhere, it, of course, is important also that we invite local practitioners, that we learn from local practitioners. And so the archive keeps growing. There are so far more than 400 artists involved in that. It's an exhibition which very much furthers and tries to further a global dialogue, but at the same time takes into account also the local. And in a way, exhibitions as they are traditionally presented, of course, are still invisible to large sections of society. So we need to think about other forms of engagement, other forms actually of more mobile exhibitions. And these exhibitions very often have a very special place in my archive, because very often these are not exhibitions made out of objects. These are exhibitions, I mean, thinking, for example, also more recently than Do It, about the exhibition It's Urgent, which started in Denmark and then went to Luma in Zurich and Luma Aal, where it grew and grew. And so far, there is more than 140 artists who made a poster answering this question, what they think is urgent in 2020 or in 2021. And so here again, the archive is not only these posters, but is also, of course, the files of these posters, which hopefully then will grow and lead to bigger posters exhibitions over the years. So in a way, these are exhibitions which are very long duration projects, and where the archive isn't just documenting an exhibition which took place somewhere, but where the archive actually can generate, can replicate. So in that sense, I would say it's about the living archive. With Do It or It's Urgent, these are living archives. And even in 100 or 200 years, if someone wants, if it's still relevant and of interest, someone could actually take, a Do It project and realize it. So so Do It in that sense is actually a living archive. Do It in that sense is actually a living archive. And we can actually think about that, the archive not as something dead, right, but as something which can continue to generate new content, which is alive, which I think is so incredibly, fascinating about the archive of the Foster Foundation in Madrid, which is this idea that the future is invented with this archive. And I think in a way, these workshops, which discuss so many different aspects of the future of the city, today it's the future of the archive, show us that we can have an archive where very much the archive, becomes a generator, right, for new ideas. And in the sense of exhibitions with Do It or It's Urgent, it means that the archive isn't just looking back, but that actually it's possibly, a generator for new exhibitions, to come. Of course, this also raises the question of where an archive is rooted. Does an archive need a place? And I do believe so. I do think that, having had this experience with my archive, having moved, for so many years, there was always a necessity for a place. But I think it's important, and that's maybe the last point. It's almost impossible, really, to talk about this wide theme of archive in 15 or 20 minutes. So maybe this is chapter 1, and we can then continue sometime in the future with a chapter 2. But to end here chapter 1, I just wanted to kind of quickly quote Amantia Diawara, who analyzed Edouard Glissant's view on this idea of an archive being rooted, or being rooted also in general. Diawara says that for Glissant, being rooted in one's country, in one's culture, in one's archive is important as long as it does not lead to the exclusion or annihilation of other people's roots, or the hierarchization or election of some roots and cultures over others. This needs to be absolutely avoided. We need to celebrate, Diawara says, in Glissant's world, we celebrate roots that expand elsewhere, roots that touch each other. They are not singular roots, they are roots that cover and protect some other. And that, I think, is a fantastic description of what an archive should do. This is why an archive should not be self-confined and just think about its own survival, its own existence, its own growth. But that's why an archive should care about other archives. And that's really what we did with this project, Interarchive, with the University of Lüneburg. We did a book also at the time, I think the book came out around 2000, where we showed how my archive is connected to many, many different archives of colleagues, of friends, of fellow travelers, of different practitioners, many practitioners also outside the art world. And we wanted to sort of ask how we can actually, in a way, have a situation where these different archives, collaborate, where these different archives exchange, where these different archives come together. And I was actually thinking this morning, we are now in 2020, and so many extraordinary new archives have emerged. It could be quite interesting to redo this experiment again of Interarchive and create an exhibition or create a book, create a mapping, in a way, of all these extraordinary archives, dynamic archives, places which understand that the archive is a living organism, and see how we can not only connect them, because very often they don't know each other, so we could make cyber introductions and connect these archives, but very concretely see what these archives could do together. And that is actually maybe the last thing I wanted to mention. So thank you so much for being here with us today. Thanks again to Elena and Norman Foster. Thanks again to the Foster Foundation. Hasta luego.